Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this edition of the 700 Club. The brutal terrorists of ISIS are saying that one of its members carried out the horrific suicide bombing in Manchester, England. It was an attack aimed at children and teenagers, and it killed at least 22 people.
Well, the wounded are being treated at 8 hospitals, and many are suffering from life-threatening injuries. Charlene Aaron brings us the story.
The explosion happened just after American pop singer Ariana Grande was closing a show at the Manchester Arena. Chaos and confusion sent concert-goers, many of them children, screaming and scrambling for the exits.
Everyone just started running, people were screaming and crying.
Grande had just gotten off stage when the explosion rocked the building.
Oh my God.
We believe the attacker was carrying an improvised explosive device which he detonated, causing this atrocity.
Grande took to Twitter to offer condolences to the victims and her fans, saying, "Broken. From the bottom of my heart, I am so sorry. I don't have words." And today, British Prime Minister Theresa May said the suicide bomber had been identified, but authorities were not naming him right away. And she promised that Britain would work hard to prevent such future attacks.
We struggle to comprehend the warped and twisted mind that sees a room packed with young children not as a scene to cherish, but as an opportunity for carnage. But we can continue to resolve to thwart such attacks in future, to take on and defeat the ideology that often fuels this violence.
And the mayor of Manchester said the city woke up to the most difficult of dawns following the bombing.
It is hard to believe what has happened here in the last few hours and to put into words the shock, anger and hurt that we feel today. These were children, young people and their families that those responsible chose to terrorise and kill. This was an evil act.
And speaking in Bethlehem in the West Bank during his first foreign trip since he took office, President Trump spoke for himself and America.
As President of the United States, on behalf of the people of the United States, I would like to begin by offering my prayers to the people of Manchester in the United Kingdom. I extend my deepest condolences to those so terribly injured in this terrorist attack, and to the many killed and the families, so many families, of the victims.
He said the bombing underscored the message he had delivered over the past several days about the need to confront terrorism.
This is what I've spent these last few days talking about during my trip overseas. Our society can have no tolerance for this continuation of bloodshed. We cannot stand a moment longer for the slaughter of innocent people. And in today's attack, it was mostly innocent children.
Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Well, we've just learned, by the way, among those dead is a precious little 8-year-old girl. This was a slaughter of the young. These were not combatants. These were not military people. And for these people to say that they're soldiers in ISIS is just a travesty on the word. They're just nothing but cold-blooded killers who kill the innocent. Well, with us for more on this terrible attack is our international correspondent, Gary Lane. And Gary, there was some indication on social media that there was going to be a terrorist attack. Tell us about it.
Yes, Pat, it was nothing specific, but there was an indication about 4 hours before this attack on Twitter from ISIS and their ISIS account on Twitter that they were going to do something. And they said this: "Are you forget our threat? This is the just terror." So in other words, have you forgotten our threat? This is just terror. They believe that their acts are just, so they're doing service for Allah by killing innocents.
Well, what more do we know about that bomber? Was he acting alone, or was there a group?
Well, he was killed immediately because he was a suicide bomber, and the authorities aren't saying who he is or who he was, and they're not saying what country he is from and so forth. Not yet. But they have another person in custody, a 23-year-old that they've arrested. After looking at security footage, they think maybe someone else was involved. So they want to make sure that this was not part of a network. And what they have with this 23-year-old, they're saying that perhaps he may be someone of interest, that both he and the bomber may be someone that both of them were known to authorities.
Now, was this a pattern, or was this just an isolated incident? Is there more to come, you think?
Well, Pat, this is the worst attack in Great Britain since July of 2005, when over 50 people were killed in an incident at that time. But what ISIS has said on Twitter, they're pledging more to come. They say this is just the beginning. Now, they said that this is in retaliation for attacks that Britain had done in Raqqa, which is the capital of ISIS in Syria, and also Mosul in Iraq. So what they're trying to do is equate bombings against ISIS in those two cities with this attack, saying it's a just attack because, after all, British bombers killed innocent children in Raqqa and Mosul. But what they don't tell you is when Britain and the Americans target ISIS in those cities, what ISIS does is they use their children as human shields. So the difference here is it's not intentional when we go after ISIS. ISIS intentionally did this to kill children.
What is being suggested that Britain can do to prevent this?
You know, Pat, that's the big question, isn't it? Now, President Trump said it's an all-out war against ISIS. He's tried to bring Arab countries together in the Middle East to combat them there in the Middle East before they get to Europe. The problem is they're already in Europe. And I stood on the border of Hungary back about 2.5 years ago as 6,000 people, refugees, were pouring across the border every day into Hungary. Hungary finally put a wall up, a fence, to keep them out. And, of course, the international community said, oh, how heartless that Hungary would do this to these poor refugees. But remember, at that time, Pat, we reported that ISIS said they had 4,400 jihadists that had infiltrated these masses of refugees, and they were pouring them into Europe as well. We believe them. When they said they had 4,400, they probably had even more than that. So how do you stop this? They probably have, more than 4,400 in Europe at this time, and there will be more to come, because as we target them in Raqqa and Mosul, where are they going to go? Now, President Trump is trying to contain them to those areas, but more of them will be coming to Europe and elsewhere around the world.
Gary, thank you for that. Well, the Manchester attack served as a grim reminder of the threat Israel faces from Palestinian terrorism. And as Chris Mitchell reports, the bombings changed the landscape of a carefully crafted series of meetings during day 2 of President Trump's visit.
At his meeting with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in Bethlehem, the president altered his prepared remarks.
The terrorists and extremists and those who give them aid and comfort must be driven out from our society forever.
Following his strong speech against terrorism in Saudi Arabia, President Trump was fired up over the carnage in Manchester.
This is what I've spent these last few days talking about during my trip overseas. Our society can have no tolerance for this continuation of bloodshed. We cannot stand a moment longer for the slaughter of innocent people. And in today's attack, it was mostly innocent children.
This was clearly not the script Abbas had written for his time in Bethlehem with the president, but it was tailor-made for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has tried to make the West understand that Israel cannot compromise its security on the front lines of the terrorist war, sometimes conducted by Palestinians. Just last week, CBN News reported on the Palestinian practice of paying terrorist salaries with U.S. tax dollars and naming town squares after suicide bombers. Itamar Marcus of Palestinian Media Watch says one such terrorist was Abu Sukkar, known as the refrigerator bomber.
What did he do to make him so famous? He took a refrigerator, brought it to Ben Yehuda Street in the center of Jerusalem, filled it with explosives, and it detonated, killing 15 Israelis. So that makes him a Palestinian hero, and there's a square in his name. Basically, anyone who's killed a large number of Israelis is presented by the Palestinian leadership as a hero to their people.
From Bethlehem, the president moved on to Yad Vashem, Israel's memorial to victims of the ultimate act of mass terrorism, the Holocaust.
2/3 of the Jews in Europe were sent to their deaths. Words can never describe the bottomless depths of that evil or the scope of the anguish and destruction.
A sometimes visibly moved Netanyahu thanked the president on behalf of the Israeli people. It was the final speech of his Israel trip at the Israel Museum, where the president really connected with Israelis, scoring a direct bullseye.
Israelis have experienced firsthand the hatred and terror of radical violence. Israelis are murdered by terrorists wielding knives and bombs. Hamas and Hezbollah launch rockets into Israeli communities where school children have to be trained to hear the sirens and to run to the bomb shelters with fear, but with speed. ISIS targets Jewish neighborhoods, synagogues, and storefronts. And Iran's leaders routinely call for Israel's destruction. Not with Donald J. Trump. Believe me.
Man, he had it on that one. I want to give you a little background before we go into our interview with David Orrin. It's so important. In 1948, the new nation of Israel came forth. On that day that it was announced, the Arab nations surrounding Israel said, we will destroy this fledgling state now. We're going to announce a war now. And they told their people living in certainly northern Israel, like Tel Aviv and other places, they said, you leave your homes, get out of the war zone, because as soon as we've beaten these Jews, you can come back in and your homes will be there. Well, the Arabs took off, abandoned their property, and waited for the victory of the Arab forces. Instead of their winning, the Jews won. The Israelis won and beat the Arabs in that fledgling beginning of their democracy. Well, ever since, there has been a United Nations organization, that UNRWA, that has kept them in essentially bondage and servitude, and they have proclaimed something called the right of return. And they have said to them, and that's what they believe in, is that they have a right to come back to the property that they abandoned at the beginning of that war. And they've also said that we can now bring not only ourselves, we can bring our relatives, our in-laws, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, all these people, and we can come back and have a place given to us in Israel. Now, that would, of course, mean that Israel no longer was a Jewish country. It would be an Arab country. And this is the sticking point, the right of return. All this other stuff is just smoke and mirrors, but this is the heart of it. Now, President Trump has talked about trying to accomplish what so many have failed to do, to bring a successful peace deal. Our CBN News correspondent, David Brody, is traveling with the president. He brings us that story from Jerusalem.
Peace in the Middle East. How many times have we heard that before? But could things be different now that President Trump is on the scene? This peace process has never seen anything quite like him. Before Donald Trump became president, he was known as one of the best deal makers in the entire world. Well, now he's come to Israel hoping for what he calls the ultimate deal. Peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's not going to be an easy task, plenty of stumbling blocks ahead, but one thing is for sure, all roads lead through Jerusalem. It's the ultimate stumbling block in any two-state solution. Both the Palestinians and Israelis see the holy city as their capital. Official U.S. policy considers it disputed territory. But as a candidate, Trump told CBN News he was ready to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
I am for that 100%. We are for that 100%.
As president, however, he dialed that back in our interview in January.
There's certainly a chance of it, absolutely. But we're doing very detailed studies on that, and we'll come out very soon. I hate to do that because that's not usually me, studies.
Right.
It's usually I do what's right. But this has two sides to it. It's not easy.
That's because a provocative move like that might disrupt the peace process before it even gets going. So this trip, with no embassy announcement, definitely disappointed many Israelis and evangelical supporters back in the United States. He did make history, though, becoming the first sitting president to visit the Western Wall. Some see that as a positive signal, although some in the Trump administration won't admit the wall is part of Israel. It's all part of a very sensitive process.
It's not easy. I've heard it's one of the toughest deals of all, but I have a feeling that we're going to get there eventually. I hope.
I do look forward to our discussions, which I think are pregnant with possibility.
The hope comes from an unlikely customer, Iran. The administration believes Arab nations like Saudi Arabia would be willing to work more closely with Israel and stand together against a common enemy, thus advancing the peace process. Waleed Faris has consulted the president on Mideast peace.
He has the heart to it. He wants to achieve it as something big that no previous president has been able to solve. But realities are realities, not just in our politics here in the United States, but in the Middle East.
The president knows he'll have his hands full getting the Palestinians to the negotiating table. His meeting in Bethlehem with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas was an attempt to see what's possible.
The problem is not between us and the Judaism. It's between us and occupation.
For his part, President Trump is keeping his cards close to the vest. He hasn't signaled yet what that peace process plan will be like exactly, and that's done intentionally. It's part of his deal-making DNA. The question then becomes, will his deal-making and his big personality be enough to push this process over the finish line? David Brody, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And we want to remind you that as David Brody travels with the president, you can follow our coverage of Trump's historic international trip on cbnnews.com. Well, our Middle East Bureau Chief, Chris Mitchell, is with us now from Jerusalem. And, Chris, I mentioned earlier, that so-called right of return. People in this audience probably not too familiar with it. Tell us what you know about that.
Well, Pat, I think you explained it very well that in 1948, when the Arab nations told the Arabs to leave because they were going to annihilate the Jewish state and push them into the sea, that they could return once they had defeated Israel. Well, that was 69 years ago, and they still haven't been able to come back. What you can see sometimes on the UN refugee camps, Pat, is these large keys, and that's symbolic, is that one day they'll be able to come back to their homes. This whole idea of a right of return is a non-starter for Israel. It would be demographic suicide for the Jewish state, but it's something that the Palestinians will never give up. So this is part of the difficulty that Donald Trump is going to have. Pat, I want to show you two things today. First of all, this was in the Jerusalem Post, and it says it's a tough deal, but we will get it done. That's what President Trump has to deal with. And one other thing, Pat, I reread your speech in 2004 to the Herzliya Conference, and I'm sure you remember that. Yeah. It's on our website. It's called Why Evangelical Christians Support Israel. And I want to just read one line in this speech that you gave. It says, the slogan, Land for Peace, is a cruel chimera. It's really an illusion. That's another thing that's going to be very difficult for Donald Trump to overcome when they try to take back the West Bank, those proverbial 1967 borders.
Well, President Trump met with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, and they both denounced the Manchester bombing. But what's the reality inside the Palestinian Authority as you know it?
Well, it was ironic, Pat, that Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas condemned the terrorism in Manchester, while at the same time he pays terrorists in Israeli jails for killing Israelis. We mentioned in our piece about the refrigerator bomber. There's also a lady named Dalal Mughrabi. She participated in the 1978 terror attack that killed 12 children, 25 adults, one of the worst, if not the worst, terror attack in Israel's history. There's 4 Palestinian schools named after Dalal Mughrabi, and that goes over and over, whether it's streets or squares, they're named after Palestinian terrorists. So for President Trump to be there, he has to recognize that Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas is sort of playing a double game. He says they teach a culture of peace to their children and grandchildren, but if you look at the Palestinian media, if you look at the names of their schools, squares, and streets, it's another different story.
Chris, Ehud Olmert, when he was president for a short time, made a proposal, as I understand it, to give half of Jerusalem to the Palestinians as their capital. I don't think they really want to do that. What's your understanding about dividing Jerusalem?
I don't think they're going to do that, Pat. I was down earlier today with David Brody, actually. Earlier, we did a Facebook Live. For people who want to see it, they can go to cbnnews.com. And when we were down there, we were looking at the same wall that paratroopers were there 50 years ago that liberated Jerusalem for the first time in over 2,000 years when the Jewish people had control over their ancient capital. And today you can see flags flying behind me, Israeli flags. They're celebrating Jerusalem Day, celebrating that victory 50 years ago. I don't think they're going to give it up. And really, Pat, that's the reason if anybody hasn't signed up for this Fathom event, In Our Hands, The Battle for Jerusalem, it airs tonight in theaters around the country. They can understand why Israel will never give back Jerusalem. There's a saying I know Gordon likes, that if you don't understand, if you don't know the history, you can't understand the headlines. And I think their recapture, their liberation of the city of Jerusalem 50 years ago was one reason it'll never go back unlike Jewish sovereignty.
Thanks.